Is the date on there? The date is on there, right?
I don't know. Doesn't matter.
When I was a little girl, very, very little, my mother used to take me walking with her at times, and people would stop us, and my mother and say, "What a pretty little girl." Well, at that time, I knew that was just about something you say to little girls. And my mother would say, "Oh, yes, and she's the only one born in America." Well, that bothered me, because when I went home, I started to cry. I didn't want to be born all alone in America. Now, my whole family had come from Russia about, well, I was born in 1910, and they had arrived, my mother had arrived about 1909, and my father had come a little bit earlier. Coming from a large family, and a family that came from, well, a very different setting than I grew up in, I was always so very interested in what was going on with them. Besides, the family never paid any attention to what I said, except to say, I think it was cute. But I didn't feel that way about it. As I've given in my chart, there were 10 children born. All grew to become adults except one who died as about a year of age. My parents came from the Ukraine. My father had been apprenticed at 10 years of age to, I believe the man was a nobleman. I was never told that specifically, but they lived in what is considered to be definitely a palace. And do you want to hold it just a moment? Because I'm losing my train of thought. Now, when my parents were in Russia, their life was a very luxurious one. My mother told me that when well, first of all, I want to tell you what the capacity of my father was. He only boasted about being the chemist, but he was far more than that. It sounds to me as if he really ran the place. He did very little talking about his past in Russia, because at that time he was very, very important. And as I grew up in my early childhood, the family had many, many reverses and financial reverses, to the point where actually there wasn't enough food or clothing. Just barely enough, with the really great effort and the help of relatives. And as I said before, my father didn't talk much about the past. My mother didn't either. They just seemed to look forward to the future. I was born when my father was 45 years old and my mother was 29. My mother was a very high-spirited woman who always tried to keep us clothed to the best of her ability. She would stay up many nights sewing. She would save money by buying remnants. She always made us look presentable to the outside world, and she always kept us in nice, decent neighborhoods. Those things were very important to her. And as I tell you more about the past, their past, you may see why she felt that way. My mother was born in an estate in the Ukraine. Just what they did there, I don't know. At that time, it was a feudal system where everything was done within the estate. Every need was met there. Her father was, she said, a bookkeeper, but I think it was more than that, because they lived very, very well. They had not only their own home, they had at least one servant, perhaps more. They had somebody used to come periodically, perhaps every 6 months or every year, would make clothes, would make shoes for them. Somebody else would come, make clothes for them. Her mother just was a lady, didn't do anything. She did assign my mother to be, who was the second eldest of 9 children, to run the place with the help of servant or servants. The oldest daughter, I don't know why, was pampered, and it seems that the mother didn't make any fuss about that. That was it. The older daughter could sleep, take it easy, and my mother managed the place. My mother told us that her mother was not ultra religious, but nicely religious, where every Friday they wear their nice clothes and the candles were lit and everything was handled correctly. And then my mother's brother, there were 6 girls and 2 boys. And by the way, they were known for their beauty, and I've been told that by relatives on my mother's father's side, that all the girls were beautiful. And most of the family were blondes with blue eyes. My mother and I think one other sister was dark-haired. And my mother was also was really beautiful. Well, anyhow, her brother, one of the 2 brothers, fell out through the ice. I don't know why he was there, but he fell through, got pneumonia. She called it pneumonia. Maybe it was TB involved, I don't know. But anyhow, he died very soon after. And her father was heartbroken, and he died too. So here were the 8 children left, 7 girls and 1 boy. My mother studied how to make patterns and became what I believe is equivalent of a designer, because she was always showed talent as far as I could see.
Her name was Sonia?
And her mother started a little store, but they lost the home that they had lived in, and they had to live in a place with an earth floor. My mother told it to me only once, but I could tell the emotion in her voice, and I began to realize why she was so insistent that at all costs we had to live decently. She didn't tell anything about the difference in their social status because of it, but maybe there was that too. No complaints about that, just tried to wipe it out of her mind. Her brother was sent to be an apprentice. There may have been 3 sons and 6 daughters, I'm not sure. I might have gotten that wrong. Because there was a son who went away to be apprenticed, like my father was. To do what, I don't know, what his role was. But he became an employee, really, under my father's jurisdiction. And at that time, my father enters the picture. My father had been so important that when he came by with his coach, the people had to bow. And I always thought bowing was you bow. But actually, I think from what I've seen in the movies, that they had to squat because he was really symbolic of the boss, the important person there. And
Now that's your father or Sonia's father? Are you talking about now?
I'm talking about my father.
Your father.
Your
Okay.
grandfather.
Charles.
Charles.
Okay.
Very important person. And he was so close to I believe that they were royalty, so close to them, that that they were invited, that when my mother married my father, they were invited to the ball. Now, how did my mother happen to marry my father? Because my father had a wife of about 10 years of marriage, I'd say, with 5 children, 10, 11 years, and his wife was dying of cancer for a long time. And when she did die, my mother's brother told my father about his beautiful sister, who was 20 years old. My father traveled many miles to see my mother. My mother said she fell in love with him. She knew that she was going to benefit by marrying him. But she was an independent person, and I don't think she would have done any, and very wise, and I don't think her mother would have permitted it unless the mother was very impressed by the young man. Not so young, he was at that time about 36 years old, but my mother said she fell in love, and I think they were married within a matter of days then. And she returned with my father to his home. Only once did she tell me, or maybe twice, that when she married my father, he told her they had only 2 children. He had 5. My mother always, throughout her married life, was very careful to have us respect and admire my father. Considering that I hardly remember a day when they didn't argue, when my mother didn't talk a lot and argue with my father, because he was a very quiet man, and keep us all up many, many nights for many hours. Evidently, they were trying to resolve a problem, but I was too little to understand completely what was going on. I knew that my mother was unhappy with something, and she was really involving my father in that. Well, anyhow, let's go back to the life in Russia. When my mother married my father, and they took this trip home, he then introduced her to his children. The 5 of them were 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 years of age. The mother had died very, very recently. It might have been a matter of just a few months. Definitely not more than a year. I don't think it was a year. And when I hold it a moment. Am I talking? The life was, I understand that their life together as a family for the 10 years that they were in Russia was very good. Excellent. My mother was able to wear a dress with a train and walk through the house or hall, that way, because she had 3 servants to do the work. There was also somebody would come to tutor them. I don't know I don't think there was anybody for the little ones, but my mother liked taking care of little ones herself anyhow. And my mother said that the family of the first wife would come to visit and were very nice to her. They were appreciative, evidently, of what she was doing. She had been startled by the difference in the number of children, but she loved children and had no difficulty handling most of them, except for the eldest. The 10-year-old gave her a lot of trouble. The 10-year-old used to gather the other children around her with a mother's picture and have them all crying about what happened. And the reason I'm sort of thinking of something else at the moment was, I forgot to mention that when my mother entered the home, not only were there 5 children instead of 2, but all of the silver, all of the linens, anything of any value had been stripped. The help, had taken everything of any value from that home. So my mother had to reestablish it, refurnish the home, do everything that was necessary. But she didn't complain too much about that. And she had the little one, the 2-year-old, naturally took to her. The 4-year-old was, the 2-year-old was Philip. And I know that Joan doesn't remember.
I remember Philip.
You do?
Yeah.
You have a good memory.
Yeah, I remember Philip.
He was a jolly little baby, evidently, because he was kind of a very likable person later. And Jenny was always a very sort of reserved person.
Was she the 4-year-old?
The 4-year-old. But she accepted my mother pretty well. In the last time I saw her, she told me that she did remember when her mother left the home. So she did remember her mother. But she didn't take it out on my mother. Manya was a very placid person.
She was the 6-year-old?
Wasn't here, wasn't there. She never made much of an impression of me, except that she was a nice person. But there was nothing outstanding that I remember. Although she did become an artist in later years. And Eugene was at a I don't know, my mother never mentioned any problem with him. And Helen was really, as I said, a problem. Now, my mother loved education. She came from a family that had a great deal of respect for universities and higher education, and her sisters did end up by marrying professional men. Now, my mother insisted that the children go to gymnasia, which was a very big honor, but also very expensive. So my father said, no, let's not do that. We're going to have more children. Don't put so much money into these children. He was not a playful person. Did you want to rest? No. He wasn't the kind who would play with the children. Although he had a wonderful sense of humor, which I'll bring out later. And anyhow, as I said, life was very, very good. And one day, and oh, by the way, I mentioned about the grapes. She would just pick a bunch of grapes and they'd send her the grapes. They also were attended the ball. As I said, they became accepted to the point of attending a big ball. And this was shortly after they were married. And my mother was she carried herself beautifully. Wonderful skin, a very, very attractive woman. And the officers began to make a play for her. So the people who cared about they pulled my father, the other people that were interested in my father, pulled him away and said, let's get out of here. You have to get out of here. And I imagine that these soldiers would be capable of killing him for defying them. So they left. After that, I don't know about attending balls or what happened. I never heard much more about it. Anyhow, as I said, Ukraine was very beautiful. There was plenty of money. There was enough money that my father made investments. He bought a lot of property there. And everything going beautifully. And one day, one of the employees came to my father and said, and by the way, employees were really the peasants who lived in that community. He said to my father, Mr. Warshaw, take your family and take them to your summer place, which was on the Black Sea. They had, I don't remember what they call them. And, little cottages, some cottage over there that they had. And my father followed his advice. And that was one of the times where, I don't know, but there were people who eventually led to the Bolsheviks. and they took over the place. I call him a nobleman because I think he was a nobility, and his family had got out, but somehow or other they got their place back. They cleared out the people who were taken over. And my father returned to his place, and the family returned. And my father sat down with my mother and he said, "Sonia," he always liked to call her Sonia. In his last years, he all returned to calling her Sonia. I don't think he ever stopped calling her that. He says, "We're going to have to go to America." Now, my father's entire family had come to America probably in the last century. His father, his mother, his brothers, his sister. Whether my father helped him or not, I don't know. His mother came from a very wealthy family. That's Charles Warshaw. His mother came from a family that I believe had silk mills. They were not too religious. They didn't observe the Sabbath too well because they would put a fire on if they wanted to, put the lights on, do whatever they wanted. I believe they traveled to Paris. And my grandfather came from a less affluent family, but a family that was very well known for their religious observations. And my grandfather was eventually was considered to be a Talmudic scholar, highly respected for his whole life. So he was brought into my father and mother's family. No, he was brought into the family of my father's parents by becoming the tutor. In other words, he was a tutor for the family. That's how my grandmother and my grandfather met. Why they permitted the marriage with a difference in financial status was probably because young men who were very religious and were known to be Talmudic scholars were highly respected. That's what I assume. Anyhow, they got married, and they lived in my father's grandfather's home. They lived very well. But one day they left. And when I found out the details one day after I left and had my husband and I leave my mother-in-law's home. We didn't steal away in the middle of the night as my grandparents did. We left after an argument because my mother-in-law was a widow and my husband was her very, very favored, dependable son. And I thought, having never had any problems with adjusting to people, I thought nothing of the fact that my husband-to-be wanted me to live with his mother. But when I found out that I was treated, well, not exactly like a child, but childlike, in being given lists as to what to buy, and reporting on how much I spent, when I had had a very, very different background, when I had a background of not only being a college student and a college graduate, but also having helped to manage one of my father's stores because he had opened up a tremendous store on 2nd Avenue with 14 salespeople. We were left, the smallest store, which was a double store, wasn't so small, was left under the jurisdiction of Morris and myself. And one of our salesmen was Phil Strax, who turned out, who was very brilliant, but not, he might not like it, but he wasn't that. My mother-in-law was a very dignified lady, and as a rule did not verbally express any disapproval or anything. But as I said, she really did not treat me as much of as an adult as I would have liked to have been treated. And besides, it's very difficult when you're a bride to have to wait for your husband to speak with his mother, who's waiting in the room right where he enters, before you can get anything from him. So that wasn't very much of my liking. And I had wanted a baby very badly, and we were very, very anxious I was very anxious to have a baby. So I had the baby by that time. It was just a couple months old. And it was time for us to have our own little nest. So I was very glad. It was very difficult to break away because my mother-in-law wouldn't have an argument. She was dignified. But thank God one day she made a remark. She got angry, lost her temper, and finally lost her temper, and said that my mother had wrote my husband in for me. Well, with that, that was it. That was a good way. Besides, I was very indignant because my mother would never have talked any of us into either marrying or not marrying anybody else. Because having gone through what she went through, she never interfered. It's one way she never interfered with us. So it was totally untrue what she said, but it gave me an excuse. So my mother-in-law, fortunately for me, decided to be taken. She always had to be taken every place. She had to be catered to her daughter's house. And I had my husband, and within 24 hours we had bought all the furniture, of which some of it is still here. That's from here. The thing in the other room is from here. Very much. There's enough still of that. We paid $700 for a whole 3-room apartment furniture, and my husband gave me $14 a week to feed the family. And things were very, very cheap, of course, at the time, but I was a good manager. All right, anyhow, what brought me up this thing, what I want to say is this. Hold it just a moment. I'm trying to get back there. When my father heard that I had left my mother-in-law's residence, he said, history repeats itself. And for the first time I heard the story about my grandparents leaving his mother's parents' home in the middle of the night, and they left a very wealthy home to live in a inexpensive neighborhood. And my grandfather never made any money. I understand he made a few attempts through a cousin I learned recently that he had started a couple businesses which didn't materialize. But he was still highly respected and well taken care of by his sons. And he was respected because he was a Talmudic student, and I'm told that he helped to establish an institution that's, I believe, on the east side, and hold it just a moment. Through Nancy Bogan, I heard that place is still in existence. Well, to get back to my parents and my father's talk with my mother about leaving Russia, the reason he gave for it was that he was afraid of what was going to happen now. My father had a hobby. He liked to read history. Even though he had a lot of responsibility, he had very, very little work to do. All the work was done for him. All he had to do was decide when the alcohol was ready, because they produced alcohol out of beets, I believe it was. And that was so to, I guess, manage it there. But everything, it was easy to manage because everybody was intimidated. They had to listen. So he said to my mother, but he said, I'm going to leave. And what I'm going to do is, I want to go to America and visit my relatives, visit the family, and see what's doing there. Well,
When would that have been? Before my father was born, or?
It's about 1905.
So before, okay.
Before your father was born. Now, my mother couldn't go with my father because her second child, Abraham, was dying of anemia. And she knew he wasn't going to live very much longer. So my father took Helen, the eldest, and anyhow, it didn't hurt to get her out of the house for a while. And he
was
took
Abraham from Sonia and?
Yeah, all the children, starting with Aunt Anne, are from the marriage of.
So Abraham was after Anne? It was before William?
Yes, she was the
Okay,
firstborn.
I never even knew that.
She was the firstborn.
I never knew there was an Abraham. Okay.
So anyhow, he said, and I have to hold it a moment. I moved to the United States, or America as they called it, with his daughter, I don't know with his first class, but he certainly must have traveled well. He came wearing a mink-lined coat. And Clara Land, a cousin, admired it. So I don't know if he gave it to her or gave it to her for practically nothing. And he was very important. They were all very excited because he was the very, very successful one in the family. He was the most admired, the most brilliant, the most everything. He was, everybody idolized him. It was, and I get that word from got it from Charlie Fervent too, how much they were impressed by my father. So they came, so anyhow, they have a visit, and Helen and a cousin, I don't know how distant, but it wasn't a first cousin, probably wasn't a second cousin, but they fell in love, and my father permitted the marriage. She was only 16 years old. And when Anne heard about it, Anne was, I don't know, about 4 years old at the time, Anne said to my mother, do they get married at my age too in America? Because she was considered a child. And here she gets married. Well, my father returned home, and he told my mother, we're going to move to America. Because his brothers had assured him that with the money he had, he could start a brewery. And he would do very well here, they said. They reassured him. So he said, but I'll tell you what. They owned a lot of property. He said, I'll go first. I'll establish things. I'll start a business. I'll start things going. I'll get a place to live. And you sell the property. Well, much more easily said than done, you know. He travels. He leaves. And it might have been partly his daughter being there too, though. But he leaves. And my mother's there with the children. And she starts selling the property. Well, it sounds, the little bit I heard, it wasn't that easy to do. She said she had to go to through a very official place she had to go to, and she said they had soldiers with sabers and everything. She said it was really very intimidating, but she walked directly and she got it all done. Of course, my father made money in later years. My mother wouldn't let him spend 1 cent on real estate because they lost some money on the deal. But anyhow, she brought back money, about $20,000, and silver and linens, and she brings the children. Well, they start traveling. Well, Morris was, he was a little over a year old. And he got sick every move they made. They had to stop. And the people soaked them for lodgings and everything. And it took them much longer to get home, get to America that way, but my mother kept the children, everything worked. Remember, she had 7 children, and let's see, she had, well, let's see, I have to figure out how many. I won't start counting. You'll have to count from 10. One had died and I wasn't born, so 8. Anyhow, she had a lot of children there. But she got them here, and they got to the boat, and she had been carrying all of the linens and the silver all that way, and somebody, like would find in a movie, somebody said they'll take care of it for her. Well, that's the last she ever saw of the silver and the linen. But all right, my father greeted her, and I don't know many details of that, and the family didn't want, and my father found out soon, by that time, had discovered that he couldn't start a brewery. He couldn't get into the field. It was locked up. Therefore, he would follow what his brother was doing. His brother had a barber supply house on the east side and was doing very well. And my father would do it too. I don't know whether it was then or soon after that my uncle had bought, together with a younger brother, had bought a building on Delancey Street near the bridge, which is a very, very important section of business section. And he had an enormous business there where retail business was good too. Barbers would come, barbers would be supplied, and people would come in and buy the shampoos and the hair tonics and the creams. And there was my father's sister's husband was taken in. He used to do the mixing of the creams together. Where they got the recipe from, I don't know. They weren't chemists, how they worked it, but they did, and it was all accepted. And my uncle evidently was a very clever salesman. He was very good. He made a lot of money. They were known throughout the East Side. They're very, very important. All right, but they didn't want my father to compete with them because they knew he was a chemist. I believe that was a reason. Whatever reason, they didn't want him there. They shipped him off to Rhode Island, to Providence, where I believe that they were having, this was about approaching 1907 already. Anyhow, there was a depression there, I think. I think times were bad. Whatever it is, my mother and my father had started a little business there by the time my mother got there, I think. And my mother came there with the children. Well, she looked at the place, and she didn't like where they were going to live. Oh, no, excuse me. I'm going jumpy. She started with what she likes, a good place to live. So she established the family in Benefit Street, which I believe is a landmark today, a lovely neighborhood. And my father's first business was on Waybosset Street, which was a very busy, prosperous part of the town. But my father lost that business. He failed. He failed 3 times. He used his brother's names to establish after bankruptcy, and it didn't work. Things went from bad, it went worse and worse, until it reached the point where he'd have to make periodic visits, and my mother would make other visits to the family to help them. My mother had one brother who would, to escape the draft, had come to America, had worked for my father's brothers for a while, but then established his own business on Clinton Street in Manhattan, in the East Side, was doing very well. And with the aid of a little bit of help from the family, with my father working very hard, Uncle Willie, we called him at the time, Uncle Bill, started delivering packages at 7 years of age. Anne, who was 14, Anne early started to work in the 5 and 10 cent store to make some extra money. Some piecework was brought in that even I, as a little tot, used to put pins on cardboard in order to make a few extra dollars. My mother did some sewing for some people. She took in a boarder for a while. This was after things got very bad. Before they got very bad, they belonged to a synagogue. And I vaguely remember that when they belonged to a synagogue, and remember that my father going, why I was with him, I don't know, but when he went to the back to ask what the number would be, that they were raffling off his package of, he had put in some of his merchandise, and they gave him a number, but they gave him the wrong number, and he didn't get what he expected. And I remember, though, instead we got a cake with whipped cream and some fruit or something, and how my father was very upset that he was lost some of his merchandise. It was that important to him. And I remember that it was a little difficult to enjoy the delicacies because of the disappointment of the family. From early on, I understand I was a very cheerful little baby. When I asked my mother, wasn't I a burden to have 1 year after you're married with things going bad? She said, you were the brightest thing for me in that particular period. She said, because you're always smiling, always acting cheerful. But as I got to know what things were like, I knew I could be playful, but I also could be very serious, and I knew that something was very difficult for the members of the family. And Uncle Morris, well, he didn't start working until he was 11 years old when we moved to New York. But before that, I want to bring out more about Morris and I in Rhode Island. I was born in Providence, so I loved it. I never got over that. I never became a true New Yorker. I always miss well, at that time the trees were very, very beautiful. And had elm trees that were majestic. They used to line the avenues. They were killed off in recent years. And the people in Rhode Island, in Providence particularly, were very, very courteous people. Everything was done without any rushing, without any criticism. It was a pleasant place to live, and everybody in the family felt that way. Only thing is, we no longer had 10 children or 9 children. We had dwindled to 4 of us, because one had died in infancy. Another one, Eugene, died when he was 29 of the flu. He had broken away from his father and established something near his sister, who lived near Boston, a suburb of Boston. He married a nurse, and she was not Jewish, but but the child who they had through the two of them has been brought up as a Jew because of her love for this husband who died at 29. It was during that epidemic, that terrible worldwide, I believe it was worldwide epidemic of the flu. I believe it was 1917. Anyhow, the other members of the relatives lost, there were other relatives that died too, at least 1 or 2. And he sent a letter to my mother and father, to both of them, saying that he had just brought his wife and baby were just coming over. They had the flu, and he had nursed them. And he said, he realizes now that he's married that he was really not right. He knows what it's like to be a father now, and he will be a good son now. Well, 2 days later, he was dead of the flu. My father was heartbroken, but my mother was not taken in. I don't think she was even asked to be wanted at the funeral. And now, I want to bring back more about Providence. It's a kind of place it was, and where does Morris and I fit into the picture? Uncle Bill was used a great deal by my father. He was also abused by my father. My father would take a strap to him, because Uncle Bill was a very headstrong boy. But my father trained him very well, and he was also a very good salesman and a very asset to my father. But my father never bothered Morris. He never bothered anybody else. He just picked on it. He insisted he wanted Aunt Anne, oh, we used Aunt Anne a great deal too, a great deal. My mother did also. But Morris and I, we were sort of left by ourselves, and we wandered around hand in hand and had a marvelous time. We had playmates, and Morris would see to it that I was accepted with the boys because, well, he wasn't going to be a sissy. And the boys accepted me because I was always game. I'd try to shinny up the poles. I was very tiny. I was about 54 pounds. I was 11 years old. I really don't think I had quite an adequate diet at the time. And that was a very, very tiny little thing. But I tried. And I would get on the fences and try to walk along them as they did. Always fell down. And but Uncle Morris was always there for me. I don't know when he started. I know that when I was a year old, I had scarlet fever at the same time as Uncle Morris and Uncle Bill. And the three of us had been in the hospital. But Morris was sicker than we were. He must have had other illnesses that came from it. You know, afterwards, whatever it was, he was in the hospital for over a year, I think, for a long, long time. And he went in speaking Russian, he came out speaking English. I went in not being able to walk, and I came back walking. My mother wasn't allowed. I don't remember too much about my mother mentioning too much about Uncle Bill. I think it was a very short thing for him. My mother wasn't allowed to come in to see us, but she'd walk up the fire escape, and she'd knock on my window, and the nurses took me in and played with me. They didn't leave me in the other quarters, and anyhow, I would wave back. All right, so I don't remember when Uncle Morris took over. It seems to me that he was always there. He taught me how to dress myself. He taught me what to do about the shoes. I never had a sense of direction. To this day, I don't have it. And I didn't know my right from my left. I literally couldn't tell the difference. So he said, "Well, I'll tell you what. You go to sleep, take your shoes and put them under the bed. When you get out of bed, you put your feet in." He always showed me how to do things, always nicely, always for a little boy, he was very dignified. He was not a chatterbox. He wasn't didn't act devilish or anything. He did his share of pranks, but he was always very calm, cool, and collected, and always knew everything. I don't know anything he didn't know. And he would do it concisely, completely, perfectly. He was the smartest person I've ever come across. Maybe, I don't know, one of these geniuses like an Einstein or something, Einstein rather, comes out like that. But he just always could do everything, and he always knew everything. And he had a spirit, a feeling of fun too, and wanted to live. He introduced me to the library very early, long before I could write. So he must have taught me how to sign my name, because I was getting books out of the library on my own. I remember walking up. It was a nice library, had beautiful steps that were like a winding steps, and as you walked up the winding steps, you saw an alcove, a little alcove, with a nest there. He showed me the robin nest with a little blue egg that was a robin's egg. Probably told me more about it, because I remember that so distinctly. And we didn't own any books at home. Well, practically none. But with the library, I got a wonderful, I had no problem. I read them. I didn't know I was reading classics until in later years when I'd say, well, I have to read this one because they talk about it. I just realized I'd read it. And I think part of the reason I don't pay any attention to names and titles was I always found out that everything had been adequately taken care of without my worrying about the names or the details. I had been there. I'd seen it. I don't have to. So anyhow, I had a very beautifully rounded education. Of course, it was Morris who took me to school and took me home. It was Morris also who, when we went to school in a 4-room schoolhouse, only 4 rooms, 2 classes 2 grades in each class. Sometimes, I don't know, it may not have happened often, but it did happen that there was nothing to eat when we came home for dinner. You're supposed to come home. We would go to school from 9 to 12, and then we'd eat, and we'd go back to school. But there was nothing there for us to eat. And Uncle Morris would just keep me home. I don't know why he thought it was better that way, but somehow or other, that was it. I can't remember. It could have been that my mother was terribly, terribly upset about something that had happened, because I imagine that when she spoke with my father, what it was all about was that she was trying to show him how they could manage things financially. See, at that time, you didn't have much help. Red Cross used to help, I think. Maybe they had a little bit of something. But there was no such thing as welfare, no such thing as getting things. You know, things were could be pretty rough. Whatever it was, she did have, at times, sort of go a little haywire. She wasn't out of her mind, but she was, like, hysterical. It would be, my father he probably didn't answer her much. I married a man very much like my husband. My husband was very much like my father. I remember my husband, if he got angry, he would just clam up, and you couldn't get anything out of him. You ever try to talk with somebody who won't answer you? It's terrible. It's a terrible, terrible feeling. It's frustrating. I managed to break through it, but fortunately my husband was well enough off maybe to take the bombardment from me, whereas my father had to just keep going and kept trying to go step after step, trying to do the best he could, working harder and harder, working tall days. He was a very strong man, physically and determined. And so whatever it is, there were times we came and there wasn't any food. I remember one winter where I think I wore the same 1 or 2 dresses for an entire winter to school. My mother always believed that you had to have something for going out. And she always was very careful with our shoes. Shoes, you had to have good shoes not to hurt your feet. She always took care of our physical needs. You had to see a doctor. And as upset as she'd get about things, if you said that you weren't feeling well, instantly you got attention. You got popped into bed. She'd make an eggnog for you. First she'd change the sheets, and she'd have a doctor see you. And she always took physical care and never talked about trouble. There would be no arguments, nothing. When you were sick, everything would be calm. It was the best period of the time with her. But away from the home and having problems at night, which was very, very embarrassing to us, because you don't like neighbors to hear your parents argue. It's a terrible situation for children to have to be with. It's hard to hold your head up straight, but we did anyhow. And the neighbors were very, very nice. So wonderful that there was one neighbor there when one time my mother somehow had forgotten, and that I don't know why Morris wasn't around at the time, but he wasn't around that time. And I remember being hungry, and I knew that if I knocked on the door that I'd be invited to have dinner with them. And I finally knocked on the door, and they took me in as a guest, and no word said, and everything. They always treated my mother respectfully, my father respectfully. They respected us in spite of everything. So anyhow, so this was it. But the fun we had, back to having fun. Oh, by the way, I was going to bring out that there were only 4 remaining. Where were the other ones? Well, Lawyer invited, no, it wasn't Lawyer first. It was my father had a sister who was a busybody, the kind who did a lot of charity for others but didn't do, well, she could have kept her own home a little bit better than she did, but she had to take care of everybody else's children, including my mother, so she she insisted that the 2 girls, Jenny and Manya, come to New York, and I think she had them work in the factory or something. But somehow or other, I don't know what happened there, but Jenny, who had been the valedictorian, or the top person in her class in gymnasia, in the school in Russia, some stage, had gotten a gold medal for it. Well, and I know she ended up in a school for nurses, and was, I've been told, it was the first Jewish graduate nurse in Massachusetts. And so anyhow, and Manya met somebody who ended up by being a communist and left for Russia, and she wouldn't go with him. So she had a child with him who lived for about 11, 12 years and then died of I don't know what. And then she became an artist. I think she used to paint pictures of him or that involved him or something, that lost the child, and married somebody who was a nice man. They had a florist shop, and she was always nice to my mother, nice to my father, not overwhelmingly towards them, but at times she would even relieve my mother when my father had a stroke, and if my mother had to get away to see me or something, sometimes she would help and take care of him. Jenny, I do remember her coming once to visit us in Providence and bringing me what looked to me like an enormous doll dressed as a nurse. And she remained close, fairly close. Philip was like one of us. Did I say four? Philip remained with us, I'm sorry. He remained with us. And he was a very, very wonderful student, terrific student, but he was sort of a manipulator or something, I don't know. He wasn't exactly a straightforward person. He was very, very loved by others. He played in amateur theatricals. He was loved. And he was liked, and he was very close to Aunt Anne. There were only 3 years difference. The two of them got along beautifully. I think they were just practically as close as Morris and I. Uncle Bill was Willie was like off by himself. I never knew who his friends were or what it was all about. But anyhow, Uncle Morris and I, to bring back to him, not Uncle Morris, I keep saying Uncle Morris. I should say Morris, excuse me, if I keep reverting to Uncle. I'm so used to saying Uncle Morris, because I'm always referring to him and my own children that way. We had escapades, too. I remember once when we were playing, and somebody said, why don't we bake some potatoes? We'll make a bonfire, we'll make some potatoes. Everybody knew what it meant. But there were no potatoes available. But we did have pear trees around there. So they brought some pears, and we were gleefully baking just a moment. See now where I was dropping off.
Pears?
Oh, bonfire. Okay. Okay. Sorry now. We were, as I said, we were gleefully, I'm repeating, gleefully watching the pears roasting, when suddenly a big man appears. He looked enormous to me, and the boys scooted. Now, how did we get in there to begin with? First of all, it was in a lot that was closed off, but we had found a plank that was loose. So they were out of our. They had skidooed, but I was so little, my legs didn't carry me very fast, and I was caught. And the man, I remember looking down at me, and then he let me go. And this was I'm wondering whether that was the first escapade I had with fire, or the second. Which one came first, I don't remember. But I do remember because another experience with making a fire on my part, although I didn't make the fire, I just watched the fire with the roasting, was when a friend, I had a little boyfriend there, my age, we were about 5 years old, maybe we were 4 years old, saying, what do you say we make a bonfire in your basement? I was never one to think up things like this. I sure was one to go along with them. I never was. So I got the matches from him. All right, we stopped the bonfire. Next thing I remember was running away from my sister, because we were right opposite a very large high school. And, just a moment. And my sister's running, they let out the school, they have the fire engines, and I'm standing there watching the fire engines from from this little boy's house with his mother. And when I came back to the house, my sister was running after me, and I'm running to try to escape her. Remember the spanking? I must have gotten one. Anyhow, that was I didn't set any fires after that. That was it. I guess that stopped me from that. So anyhow, Morris was not in on that one, no. And I think he might have had more sense than I, too. Now, in that same period of time, shortly afterwards, maybe I was a year or two later, Morris saved my life. How did he save my life? Well, I think it was my sister was cleaning the house. She was always complaining because I never did any work in the house, so I decided to help her to carry out some brooms or something down the steps. Whether it was one or more, I don't know. But I tripped on it, and I was falling down head first. And Morris came along to catch my head at the bottom of the steps. She shouldn't have let me do it, but I never thought of that until now. But it happened. So now, also, I remember when we moved to New York when I was 9 years old. I wasn't quite 9. Morris still, at that time, for a little while there, he had time to be with me and to wander around with me. Now, from the time I could remember, my mother always gave us money for a movie, except they didn't have to give money for me because I was so little I could always pass as underage, so I got it for nothing. And she would give a penny a day for candy, which wasn't bad. You could sometimes get a half a cent's worth of this and half a cent's worth of that. It wasn't too bad, but these were a must. You must have that. Ice cream, only if somebody treated. And then I always ate it too fast and was jealous of everybody else because they still had ice cream and I didn't have any left because I gobbled it down. So anyhow, I remember once there when Morris said, instead of going to the movie, let's buy magazines. Well, what was a magazine? It wasn't really a magazine. It was a soft-covered book because of Horatia Alger. And I remember reading and loving Horatia Alger's stories. Things got a little bit better in the business. Morris started helping out at 11. Uncle Bill was, at that age already, 13. He was a man as far as my father's concerned. Probably was a man in many respects. But, by the way, when we bought the Horatia Alger book, magazine, we also had money left over to buy a can of beans. So we had that. But anyhow, then at that point of his life, Uncle Morris had started his lifelong friendship with the with the Finkelstein twins, Maxwell and Manny. Maxwell, strange thing, twins, identical, yet Maxwell liked me and Manny so-so. Maxwell would take me home when Morris had to go to work. So it was after Morris was 11 years of age, Morris used to have to go take a trolley to the east side and have to go to work. But Maxwell would take me home. And I think Maxwell, as the years went by, had liked me a little bit. It was a little, like a budding romance or something. And Manny, forget it. But then, when I started high school, I had been a year behind in school because they didn't think I was so smart when I started. I don't know what they did. They felt I wasn't learning how to read well enough. So instead of when I was in 1A, I was put back to a special group where I was taught how to, they kept me reading the Three Little Kittens until I could scream, but I learned how to read well. So I lost a half a year. Then I had whooping cough. I didn't go to school for half a year, so I lost a year. So I'm a year behind. All right. So anyhow, the Maxwell twins, when I graduated high school, I'm a year behind. So I'm 15, I started high school. And the Maxwell, the Finkelstein twins were the rage, like Frank Sinatra would be to teenagers. Oh, everybody's wild about those twins. They were tall, dark, handsome, bright, everything you could want. They had their own clique, which Phil Strax was part of the clique, and they were it. And of course, they were Morrison, very, very close to them. And he would make posters for them when they ran for office. And he himself wanted to be an important political figure, but he just didn't have that push, that something or other that is easy to, that people respond to very quickly, that charisma or type of thing. So, but they appreciated him. They were good at him. And they're very, very important. And they were very good in the debating team and Eastern District High School where I started. Very good. I started up the debating too. But I had barely started, and I remember there was to be an important examination. And at that time, we'll postpone the examination. Maxwell Finkelstein developed meningitis. He's in the hospital, and too bad you don't know shorthand.
No, it's fine.
He's in the hospital, and I remember visiting him. I think his brother was a doctor. Pretty sure he was. And he went to Mount Sinai Hospital, I believe it was. Anyhow, the room they gave him was tremendous, and he lived. He survived it. And he was brought home, and I remember the friends and a cousin, the girl here that was close to them, coming to there, and I came to visit too. We all came to visit. And I remember Maxie, we call him, picking a rose from flowers were given to him and handing it to me. And right after that, he died. I don't know why, but he died because he had survived it, I thought. And the funeral, everybody wanted to go to the funeral from the school. And I had this important examination, so I went to school, and then I asked to be excused, and they wouldn't excuse me. I was heartbroken. And then the family changed the name to Maxwell from Finkelstein. So that's Manny Maxwell, whom you know. So, and as I said, I was very close to Maxie, and to me, there was no closeness with Manny. There was their personalities. One was more selfish, one was more less. So they were different, in spite of everything. Anyhow, maybe Manny was born 2 minutes earlier, or something. He took over. So anyhow, I remember when they were very friendly. I'm not really friendly. I mean, before, when they were young, when the three boys were there, Manny, Maxie, and Morris, taking me every place, including skating, which I didn't know how to do. And so I put on a pair of skates, and I wonder who did it to me, but one of them decided to trip me up and, to leave me there without help. And I remember they're laughing when I didn't know how to get back. Like somehow they evidently got back then. But I remember Maxie took me home. And after that, he always made sure to take me. He took me home anyhow. So afterwards, in regard to my closeness with Morris, even though our paths didn't stay directly together, because actually, when he was working in the store, we took turns. Well, that's later on. There always were talk. Every once in a while, there'd be a midnight talk. He'd come from work, and the two of us would talk. He did all the talking. I did all the listening. And I didn't even want to talk. I wanted to listen. But I always I used to enjoy this. I got a kick out of this fact that he would say things like, if you use an argument to tell somebody why they're wrong, or you want to sell them something, he said, you always you use the arguments to convince them. He said, what they don't know is you could take other arguments and go the opposite way to be just as convincing the other way. And he'd always say we. He'd always use the expression we. And I always get a kick out of it because I hadn't said anything. I hadn't formed the opinion. He was the one. So, but gradually, not very gradually, it seemed to abruptly, at 11 years of age it began, that instead of always being there with me, I was alone. I was used to thinking of myself in school and managing things in my school life. But away from school, I was lost without him. Besides, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether I had an opinion of my own. I always wanted to ask Morris, well, what should I do? What do I say? I wanted him to tell me what to do. As a matter of fact, when I was 40 and I started teaching, I took a course in student teaching because I hadn't been trained to be a teacher. So the instructor there was very put out with me. He said, you act as if you'd like me to take your hand and lead you. I said, that's exactly like somebody take my hand and lead me. Because I always had a very feminine feeling of wanting to lean on somebody, to tell them to take care of me. But sometimes I found that that if you start leaning, there's nobody there, you fall down. So I learned to get up, and I don't think I would have known that I was a very good student if it weren't the teachers told me that. They had to not only give me good grades, they had to point out to me that I was good, I was outstanding in this, and that they had to push me into believing in my own abilities. And they did a very good job because they convinced me. Of course, when I got the magna cum laude at the end there, I was thoroughly convinced, although I didn't know what magna cum laude meant. I didn't know. Morris, who was so happy with my degree, so thrilled with it, had to tell me what I was getting. I didn't know. I just plowed along. I did what I could, did the best I could, and happy that I was making out well. Always so sure that I was going to fail, that the people around me were always ready to murder me when I'd top a list or something, because I was one who always thought I didn't know, I was going to make out well. I'm surely going to fail and everything. Always very insecure feeling. But which brings me to the education. Our educational pursuits veered. First of all, although your father, Morris, was very close to getting his degree in law. As a matter of fact, he was so close that actually it was a matter of months when he would have gotten a degree, his law degree, combined with a bachelor's degree, because he went to NYU first in order to do, and then the law, to do what his friend Manny did, to take the two of them together to get both degrees at once. He could have gone right into law school and done a 2-year course and have made it. He would have made it. But what he really wanted as he was growing up was to be a doctor. I don't know why he wanted to be a doctor. I don't remember why. I don't remember anything he did that symbolized his interest in it. But he always said he wants to be a doctor. And I always felt that what Morris wants to do, he can do. I had no doubt in my mind. And he always was, as I have said before, he was a student who achieved without any effort and always did it. And if he wrote a letter, well, the person who's like that, Myron is that way. Myron, if he wants to write a letter, he sits down and he does it. He doesn't have to. I write a very good letter, but I have to write it and rewrite and correct it, condense it, because I think that to some extent that I may originally have, well, I don't know, I always end up with a very concise letter, the opposite of my speech. But I don't do it without effort. I have to figure out what's the first, and I have to sort of make a little corrections as I'm going along. I sort of suffer through making it simple, to try to simplify it, to get at the nut of the thing. And I don't talk that way at all. I just ramble. I go on, and always expect that somewhere people will understand what I'm driving at. Because I do things like Bob says. Bob, who takes after his father very much, says, Mom, he once said a long time ago, Mom, you take simple things and you make them complicated. That's how it struck him. But actually, I don't think that's true. Because I think that actually the reason I talk the way I do is because I think that if I give a person some insight as to why I come to a certain conclusion, that they will have a better understanding of what I'm saying. To me, to just say a thing is so and expect anybody to accept it is something I wouldn't want for myself. I don't want to be told, this is it and you've got to accept it, because I object to that. I feel there can always be some reason that maybe there's another side to it, maybe there's another angle, and maybe the person who's saying it is wrong. I don't care how important the person is, and I have found that true. And when I got that magna cum laude, it was because that was my attitude, that you can be wrong. And once there, we had an examination, and it was a psychology course. I think abnormal psychology, I don't remember what. And because that was my minor, I had quite a bit of psychology. Matter of fact, they wanted me to be the major in it. They tried to persuade me to. And they were about, a large class. Gee, it must have been 100, a very big class, enormous. And we had an examination, because he really practically, I guess he used to lecture more or less. And the man came around, he was the instructor, professor, I don't know, and he comes around, he's walking around, he comes to me, he said, he doesn't say he said, you were the only one to get that one question he mentions correct. Out of 200 people, there's only one to get the right answer. Why to have the right answer? The question called for, it was multiple choice, called for never. No, it called for true or false. In other words, the answer was never. And I put down never. It can never happen. Nobody else had the guts to say it couldn't happen. So that's it. Now, I'm getting so used to seeing Gerald Silver there, I'm beginning to miss it. But now around, I'm losing my trend of thought. So turn it off for a little while. I'm not kidding. Morris was, as I have mentioned, a very bright, articulate person, with not only just articulate, but he could do anything and everything. And he got some rewards from that. He was skipped an entire year before we came to Rhode Island, from Rhode Island to New York. I have to get it straight. I was not quite 9 years, and Morris was over 11 years of age when we came to New York. And my other brother, Bill was 2 years older than Morris, so that was the age differences. Now, when we entered elementary school, all three of us were threatened with being put back because of coming from another state. Uncle Bill, they put down, they put him back 1/2 a year. This is in spite of good records. Mm-hmm. And Morris, they put back a year because he was a year ahead. And they wanted to put back again. I'd lost a year already. But a guardian angel was there for me. This was a very large school. They had 3 principals. And the principal for the youngest group came from Rhode Island. Now, when I was tested, I knew nothing about their arithmetic, because I was taught how to multiply, and here in New York, they added the dot addition. I knew nothing about, let's see what else, reading, writing, arithmetic, yes, writing. I didn't know how to write. I only knew how to print. They started us off with printing. So, illiterate. But I know how to read very well. So that what I lost from kindergarten, which would very hurt me a lot, did me in good stead there. So on the principal's recommendation, I was put into the regular class. Well, picture coming from a suburb of a small city, relatively small, to the Williamsburg with a large, and very few Jews, I knew very few Jews, into a really highly competitive Jewish school population. And I sit in this classroom. Teacher was a real tough New Yorker. Move this, move your legs, do this, do that. Couldn't ask questions, didn't try to teach me. Is privately, just do, just learn. Well, I didn't have a foundation. So I get 0, 0, 0 in arithmetic. Suddenly, I don't know, I caught on. I jumped to 100. Teacher's very proud of herself. She takes me, marches me into the principal's office. Look at what's been accomplished. Spelling, we used to have to use a palm penmanship with a wooden pen, with an old-fashioned pen point, with an inkwell, and you must hold your hand a certain way. And I have the bump from doing that, holding on. And the minute her head was turned, I would go my own way. Anyhow, I didn't know what supervision was. That she was being supervised. She was getting that the principal came in to observe. I'm forgetting terms already. She was being observed. So they're walking back and forth, and as they pass around, passing the back. Not back and forth, they're walking around to the student. The principal and the teacher's in front, the principal, and the teacher points and made some derogatory remark about my lack of achievement in writing. And the principal pats my hand, because the tears were welling in my eyes, and said, "This little hand is going to do a lot of good things." Well, from that day until the day I graduated, that principal watched over me. She used to go into every classroom and tell the teacher, good and loud, so all the students could hear, what a good student I was. And I really just swallowed it completely, and it helped me. I had that same teacher for 3 terms. With one interval, I think, there, 1 year and then I had her again. I met her after I graduated from public school. And she said to me, she said, "You were the most polite little girl I'd ever seen." But she didn't know how to handle a polite little girl, because she heard that polite little girl. But anyhow, I remember standing up for honors at graduation, and before that graduation, the proud principal. But before that, the children, my classmates, were walking around and asking me, "How do you write a composition?" I didn't know why they were asking me. And I found out what? This principal was showing my composition to everybody. This is the way you write a composition. And by the way, when I was 14 years old, I went to Ellis Island to show the Statue of Liberty to a friend from Providence, an old friend. And Morris was with me. 3 of us went. And when we were walking up these steps, whenever we were doing that day, even walking, I said, "Why do you want to walk in the sun? I'm too hot." I didn't feel well. I felt sick. Turned out I had typhoid fever, which I had lost another term practically, but they let me take the exam and exempt me from the finals because I know what to do. So I almost lost another half a year. But anyhow, now, all right, Uncle Morris worked in the store regularly When I say now I have to point out that that business was open 7 days a week. Most people lived at the store. Now, my mother refused to have her children in the East Side, as she refused to let us live in anything but a decent neighborhood, even if you went hungry when we were in Providence. Even though you had to travel over from the business into Williamsburg, even though it necessitated walking 6 flights of steps without an elevator, and my father wasn't that young anymore, all of us had to walk up 6 flights of steps to be in a decent neighborhood, because she didn't like the other places there. This is what Uncle Morris did. He would go to school full time. He would then come to work, and he went to Boys High, which was a very prestigious school. As a matter of fact, Girls High was, the 2 of them were for the very bright ones. They wanted me to go there, and I said, no, go, because I want to have the boys around. Which wasn't so stupid on my part. I didn't want to diminish I had an instinct to be feminine, not to want to be. Not that the boys in my class would take me out, because they didn't like me outwitting them. You know what I mean? I had a bit, but that's what I wanted. And Morris, I don't remember any honors. He never tried to get honors. I don't think it would have been possible to worry about meeting everyday needs that much. He never failed anything. I used to worry when he was going to take an exam, if he occasionally took a few hours off, supposedly to study. You know what he used to do? He used to sleep. I used to say, Morris, please, please, study. I couldn't imagine, how could you pass without studying? But he did. He was naturally very envious of the Finkelstein, of Manny Maxwell by that time. And he would have liked to have done things the same way. And here he had his whole group. Phil Strax came from a very, very, family that had very, very little financial resources, yet they all got their education. They all were given the time. If they took jobs, it wasn't too wearing and tearing it. I don't know how they did it, but they did it. And all his group that he went with, they didn't come from wealthy families, but they all, somehow they're able to get what they wanted. But my father he always kept feeling, we're going to build up the business, we're going to build it up. He used, as a lot of people do, he used to use the family to build up, to build up, to build up. The protector of our education was my mother. She wasn't able to protect Aunt Ann, who also was a valedictorian, was also a top student, because when my father took her out of high school, after 2 months there with her friends and everything going through, and she was working for the 5 and 10, where they offered to pay her the same salary and let her continue her schooling, my father said no. His brother said a poor girl can't go to school. He didn't think a girl needed an education anyhow. But so Aunt Ann has always regretted that. She felt it was always something she felt very, very badly about. Now, I continued school because of insisting upon with my father. I didn't listen to him. But I want to return to Morris. With Morris, he graduated from Boys High, and he felt that it was better. He wanted to do what Manny was doing, so he went to NYU, and he did adequately, and to Brooklyn College, Brooklyn Law School, which I think was a good, as far as I know, it was a top school. I didn't hear of it failing anything, but that was in the 1931, and by that time, our business had failed. Now I have to return to what happened in between financially in the business. In 1917 or 18, the uncle who owned this enormous business, together with a younger brother who he'd taken in, and a lot of relatives whom he'd taken in, a sister and a husband or her sons, and all working for it. This uncle developed cancer of the stomach and was dying. When he was dying, he told the brothers that they were to take my father in because he wasn't making a go of it in Rhode Island. And my mother stayed there to run the whatever little bit they could make out of the business. She could make out of the business, and my father was working in their store. Now, I don't know what they paid him, but small, his salary. As soon as the uncle died, they sold the business. They sold the building and closed up the business. The widow gave my father $1,000. It was something in the Jewish religion something that the older son is supposed to take the widow as a bride or something, I don't know. But whatever reason, she gave him $1,000. And with that, my father opened up a store. Now I was well acquainted with the opening up of the store. I remembered how he would get some carpenter to put up a few shelves and he would start off. Well, the same thing happened here. Pardon me. But now he had Anne. When they were moving to New York, my mother did what her mother done for her, had her develop some training. My mother had been taught how to make patterns, and Aunt Anne was taught bookkeeping within a few months, and she became a bookkeeper. And when she'd be through with her bookkeeping job, she'd go in the store and wait on customers. Uncle Bill was a very good outside man to sell to the barbers, and there was good trade there. We would have a store in Stanton Street, which was right off from the busy thoroughfare. Now, my uncle was on the main one. Clinton Street was one of the, where they had dresses. Do you remember, the Clinton Street?
Yeah.
And he was doing well, except for this. He was a gambler. He liked to play cards with his friends. That's my mother's brother, the only one she had here of the family. He liked to play cards with them, and he gambled away the money. So, after my father had made quite a little bit of a go of it, he, tell me for a second. He sold what they call selling the key to my father, so my father took over the lease. And my father took over the business. Now, by that time, Aunt Anne was beginning to go with Harry. They had a courtship of about 3 or 4 years. And I don't remember Aunt Anne was ever in the business when it was on Clinton Street. So she got married, and she didn't do any work. She didn't work for the store anymore. Uncle Bill was the outside man. Morris was a salesman. I was started when I was 15 to go to work during the summer, not during the winter, because I was always worried that I'd fail if I didn't study, so I didn't give them, and I was pampered. I only worked on Saturdays and Sundays. I didn't work during the week. So anyhow, my mother she didn't get behind the counter. My father didn't either. He did the manufacturing. He used to supervise the stirring of the, manufacturing in the back room there. And my mother rented an apartment, if you can give it the dignity of calling it an apartment, a flat, in one of the buildings there. So I became acquainted with how very, very poor people live, where they have to go outside to go to the toilet, which is a very, very small toilet, where you don't have a bathtub. You go to the Turkish baths if you want to get a good one. Otherwise, I don't know, with a tub that's brought in or something. And I remember, I'll never forget the ugliness of the green walls, enamel or something, that when my mother was cooking, it would steam. It wasn't pretty to look at. And but it did the trick. And my father was in heaven that he was having his meals. So my mother was a very good cook, and my father loved her cooking. He admired it so much, he felt she could make a fortune with her cooking. She was a terrific, champion blinza maker, and things like that. She was very, very, I don't know, she wasn't an ordinary cook. And So anyhow, got better and better. I remember the excitement at Christmas time when people would come. We used to have big sets of the perfumes and things and the powders and all, and fancy things. We used to even carry these silver comb brush and sets, and business was very, very good. And the outside business was good. Uncle Bill was doing a good job for my father. And things got so good that my father bought a larger store, which was like a double width, and it got even better. And meanwhile, salesmen were hired, and it was still the arrangement, Uncle Bill outside, and Morris and I inside. By that time, I was more active. I was not full-time yet either, so it was salesman. And then, oh, and by the way, Uncle Bill dropped out of school because he was playing truant because he couldn't do his homework and he couldn't do his work and everything, and he dropped out. But anyhow, he's full-time. Things are going well. We're making out nicely, and we're enough to enlarge. And Morris, meanwhile, is going to school to, by that time, I don't know, at some point he started the law school. That might have been a little bit later, but he was to get law school. And I'm going on, I'm doing, I had changed from Eastern District to Erasmus Hall, and then I then enrolled in Long Island University. Second year they ever had one. It was really like it was a converted factory. Pardon me. And only had 300 students total. And why did I pick it? Because it was the cheapest. My father didn't want me to go, and I thought it was finances. I was wrong. He could have afforded to send me to a better school, but he didn't want me to go. I was good at selling, so he wanted me there. And when he objected, and the only time we really had a talk that went on for hours and hours, and I won, he didn't know, but I made a silent resolution that I would work for him just as if I weren't going to school, which I lived up to, because I used to work in the store, go to school in the daytime, come home, try to get there in time so that Morris would get to his law classes. Sometimes I'd be a little on the late side, because then I changed NYU, so it would be better for me to do that. And I would cross, I remember crossing and trying to hurry so I'd get there because he couldn't leave the store empty and he couldn't lock it up. And then I would work till 12 o'clock at night, and then study till 2 in the morning and go to classes till 7, get up at 7 to go to classes, fall asleep in class, but somehow or other I handled it because I could talk my way out if necessary. And meanwhile, Uncle Morris, no credit with him, he always passed everything, and he's supposed to go. But then came 1929. Now, my father had opened by that time this very large store on 2nd Avenue with 14 salespeople. And as I said before, I don't know whether I mentioned it before here, about being left in the store with, it would be Uncle Morris and I taking turns, really, to some extent, and then later on, 2 of us be there later in the night. And somebody called Phil something or other, another Phil, I think his name was Phil, but they had a very good salesman there, that my father always said was swiping things, but anyhow, good salesman. And then Phil Strax came in the picture somewhat there because, Morris wanted him there, and he did it. And then, all right, then came 19, and here, they were in the large store. Oh, my father got the best of inlaid linoleum and big showcases and had these adding machines and really everything wonderful, and money was pouring in. But it was, oh, and we moved into a beautiful apartment house with a penthouse up there. We didn't have a penthouse, but it was classy on 12th Avenue, on 2nd Avenue and 12th Street, and very, very ritzy with a doorman painting as you enter, and and you have to be Paige. Our apartment had, the one room was as large as long as this whole thing, and wide, a beautiful dinette, and tremendous bedroom, and very, very beautiful. And all right, so we're all set. The business is going well. The 2 stores, everything's going very well. And 1929 was our Waterloo, because I think it was called the Bank of the U.S., I'm not sure the name, first bank to close up. My father's entire money was there, cash. Now, doing well depended upon having the cash. As a matter of fact, one reason my father expanded is I had a little bit to do with that. When he had only 1 store originally, he used to use what they call a jobber and buy a small amount at a time, but you pay higher prices. One day I said to him, why doesn't he buy direct? And when he started buying direct, he was able to compete better. Oh, in that time, I want to bring out what Uncle Morris used to do. We were doing this competition originally when we were in charge of the Clinton Street store. He used to send me to a competitor 2 blocks away to see what the charge was, or a block away, to see what they were advertising on the window as a special, so that we could compete. And he'd put a special going lower. So this met the competition. So when my father lost his cash, he lost his credit, because he had been rated very nicely in Dun & Bradstreet. And when he lost his credit, he had to use a jobber. And you'd have to call in your order every day. And why were things getting so bad, particularly so quickly there? Because our main success on the 2nd Avenue store was through the trade of the Jewish actors community and people around there. They used to come in and buy. I remember there was one perfume called Christmas Eve. It was a very expensive perfume, and they'd pay enormous amounts for the perfumes. And as soon as the Depression hit, 1929, very soon after, our trade dwindled. It kept dwindling and dwindling. And not dwindled, it probably went abruptly down. I think abruptly down. And I was, just hold it. My mother she had saved some money. Not that my father didn't know, he pretended he didn't know, because he said something about bring out the bundle now. Because he was very, very, he was stingy. Stingy. He kept saying, first you don't spend and then you save a lot, then you can spend. But you wait, you wait. My mother said, no, you have to live as you go along. So she'd have to sneak in a good pair of shoes for me, because I couldn't wear, I had a very narrow foot, and I only could do, I couldn't wear the cheap shoes, and she believed you should look nice. So the business was going down. But meanwhile, I wanted to go on a trip, and nobody stopped me from going to an adult camp there where first I went to visit my friend whose parents had a place near there, but then I shifted over it. And then there was a check issued for payment of my being at this camp Tamerman. And Uncle Morris would have to do, it was time for him, it was time for him to pay his tuition fee for the following year. So it was not a few months, and it was a year that he lost. Mm-hmm. And he told me in later years that he didn't pay his own, that when the checks came back, insufficient funds, he covered mine, but he didn't cover his own. So he lost out there. I mean, I don't have everything just exactly right, but I know that's why he did. But if he didn't mention that he had been trained to be a lawyer, it could be because if he mentioned that he wanted to be a doctor, that it wasn't that much of a loss to him. Because actually, I imagine if he cared enough, he might have been able to do it while he was married, because people do those things. He didn't seem to make any attempt there. But I know this, that he did a very good job with his, when he was working for this insurance company,
Yeah.
they used to use him to make up the briefs, and then they would use it. And he even used to say, well, they'd say, well, why do you put in so much? Why don't you make it listen? He'd ask them, well, show me what isn't important. Now, Myron is that way, too. He makes everything, he uses all his energy. Instead of making money on it, he does everything so thoroughly. But actually, if you really understand, they're important.
Mm-hmm.
So he did these things important. Meanwhile, he was getting satisfaction, I know, by being elected to be president of the Parents Association of the city. Where was it? It was some important role he had with the parents.
PTA was in my school in Madison,
Was it?
in the high school.
High school?
Mhm.
I know he was proud of that. And he was very happy with his family and all. But of course he was frustrated, not being able to achieve, to be able to achieve a little bit more than he had. It's particularly because he traveled with this group who really all started with practically nothing, and they all made it. So, but it's very difficult when you have not only a family who's not pushing and not helping you, but a family that is draining you. I mean, actually, but I don't know what else could have been done, because actually everybody tried so hard. And considering that my father was 45 when I was born, and there were all of these other children, and I have a feeling that some of the money might have gone to what I call the stepchildren, because I don't know how Jenny had the money to go to nursing school. And I know that Philip would come and want things, and there may have been other things that, I mean, some of the arguments that came up between my parents might have been because of things done. Being helped to others might have been. Now that I'm reconstructing it a little bit, in later years I'm thinking, my mother was always very much for helping children, and I feel that she might have become very attached to them and may not have wanted to deprive them of anything, because she had a feeling of fairness. So really what it was all about, I don't know, because I really never heard the actual words to express. I would only hear some of my mother get discussed and finally practically call him a name or call him something and disgust or something. But if it was trying to reason with him, I never heard the reasoning. I don't know why not. But Joan, is there anything else that you feel that you want to turn it off while she's
Okay.
thinking? My family, the last time I remember being in the one and only time I recall being in a synagogue as I was growing up, was once when I was approximately, I suppose, 3 or 4 years of age, that I had mentioned before. For a while, my parents had friends who would, well, I guess they always had friends who were Jewish, but they saw them more frequently. But as time went by, they didn't enter a synagogue at all. There was no living up to, my mother acted as if she were keeping a religious home, but she didn't actually do that. She tried to use kosher food if she could get it. She tried to follow tradition. My father was only interested in there's only one holiday that he respected, and that was Passover. And that one he very much respected. You had to the children had to be very quiet. And I was given wine from the time I could remember, and I'd fall asleep and be carried off to bed. So that took care of that. So, but you had to, and he'd always tell us a story of Passover. And he really had a high respect for it. So in one of the few conversations I had with him, I found out why he acted that way he did about religion. He said when he was 4 years of age, he was brought to school. I can't remember what you call it when they're...
Cheder?
Cheder.
Yeah.
And he didn't like the way he was treated. I don't know, he never mentioned being hit, but he didn't like it. And then, remember, he was 10 years of old when he was apprenticed away from Jewish people. He never turned towards Christianity or anything like that. He always taught me to respect Christ. He said he doesn't believe in his divinity, but he said he was a very fine philosopher. He was a good man. So he respected him. But he said as far as being kosher is concerned, more than once that he did repeat. He said it's ridiculous. He said there was a reason for kosher. He said those times they used wooden plates, and he said and they to mix the two kinds of fats was not healthy. He said and a lot of the kosher rules are based upon hygiene. So he said that makes good sense, but it's whether not as necessary today to do it the same way. It doesn't make sense. So for that reason he felt, now whether it was a justification, because he couldn't afford to go to a synagogue, which he probably couldn't. My brothers did not go to Hebrew school. And it was very embarrassing to them. My father made no apologies otherwise. Of course, his apology was mostly, it's a lot of nonsense. But when things got really good, my mother and father used to go to a nice synagogue, and more of the free synagogue. Sit there, and I don't know what the free synagogue, I know it was a nice Jewish center in Eastern Parkway they'd go to, and they liked that. But that was a story about his feeling towards religion. My father also was very, very, he could foresee things to come. He could foresee, like he said things like, why do they waste the power of wind? Why don't they use more? And today there are some in that. A lot of things that came to pass he came out with. He was very understanding of the world around him. My mother had a wonderful understanding of people, and wonderful with children. Brought them up without pushing, encouraged and made them feel important. Now, when teaching biology, and teaching eugenetics, one of my favorite motivations was, I can't remember the exact wording I used in it, but what I was aiming towards was the fact that, or maybe it was one of the examples, that it's always interesting to me to know that my father, who had 2 wives and 10 children, 5 each, in one side a lot of music showed up, none on my side. So I credit it probably has something to do with that wife that died. So there was a lot there, and it's all mentioned in that material I gave, if you want to pick it up from that, because Lawyer had a daughter, 2 daughters, very musical, very good. One of the violin, who did not make a career of it, and Clara, who became a well-known celloist.
Yeah.
And but science on both sides. As I have mentioned in the notes I made, Esther, who is a daughter of Helen, told me that the last name, that her husband's name was Block. I only seen her twice in many years. And I should remember that because they have a son who is well known as a scientist, whose name has appeared in Scientific American. Now, I don't know all of the descendants of my father, but I remember that when I saw the Bob Epstein and his wife one day, there was some scientific question whether something could scientifically be. I thought a little invention would be good of some sort, involved scientific ability. So I said to Dolly, I said, listen, among your 7 children, I'm sure there's one of them who's a good scientist. She said, Mark.
Mark is a scientist, right?
Without hesitation.
Right.
And Myron. And I have some flair for it. So that, now music on my side, no. Absolutely. From my mother, from this side. They don't show. Artistic, yes, strongly. That shows up. On my father's side, my own side. I mean, professional, and on my Manya's pictures are in some museum, I don't know where, and they're the one I did see, that one that was given to Richard Land. I saw one, and it shows a little lonesome little boy in a corner. It didn't look that wonderful to me, but they evidently see something. My mother said one of her sisters was an artist. I know that I have a flair for it, but they didn't want to. They said I changed. I changed. I keep erasing. I'm not free. I don't do it free enough. Too meticulous is your father. But yet, when he wanted to make a painting for me by 20th anniversary, not 20th anniversary, he did one in 2 hours, and yet he would do everything meticulously. So the talents are in music and science and art, and they're there. I unfortunately don't have all the. It would be interesting to really get the whole pedigree of what has happened to all of
them.
There must be a lot of them.
That's what Gil's are doing with this.
Because Loria had not only. She had so many children, and some that I've only seen twice. One I saw twice in life, the other one once. So now you have to get going.
I just have to ask you one more thing. You said something about my father writing a composition for you or something?
I don't want to look for it, I can't find it. One composition was selected. He gave me the idea for it, and it was, we had at least 6,000 students in the school, and mine was one of 5 picked, and then they put me in a room and said revise it, and I couldn't change it, so they didn't select me. I selected him. And the other one was a wonderful story in DOA, and I looked for it and I can't find it. When I find it, I'll have to send you at least a copy of it, where he just stood there, and maybe in 10 minutes he gave me the whole thing, dictated it to, and it was selected to put into the magazine, which is a very nice one, which was based upon the little, that I was telling you about, that the flat that my mother rented, that little room.
Right.
Well, he pictured, he said, it's dead on arrival. The police came, they came, and they found somebody was dead, so they go to pick up the body, and he said, and they look around there, and there's some flowers dying. And he goes into it to like how the flowers dying as a man was probably dying, but it's showing something else that showed, and then he went to something like that. And I've often wondered with DOA, there was a picture called DOA, well, they picked it up after that, but I'd like to pick it up. But a simple little story, but a nice, but he did in no time at all.
Yeah. Just maybe that's what Danny Gensel was writing ability from.
He liked to write, he could write beautifully.
Yeah.
Well, you know that.
He had some great poems.
You know, when he died, there was a letter there from somebody who said that now I have to send a condolence letter, and which Morris could do so beautifully with no effort at all, just could do the ones he could do.
Did you have any songs that you used to sing as kids, or didn't you sing?
Oh, first of all, when I married my husband, he said, Ceils, I love you, but please don't sing.
Oh. Okay. Okay, because I wanted, like we sing songs to the kids, like
Morris, I don't think was too much better. And Bill maybe could carry a little bit. Maybe Aunt Ann could carry.
No, actually, my father sang. He was in the school shows. He said we have him sing. He sang in the school, the PTA shows. He sang.
Oh, well, maybe I'm belittling him. I was lousy. But then I belittled him. I thought maybe he couldn't because I don't remember singing.
There probably wasn't much singing in the
Oh, and I
house
have to
then.
tell you one little anecdote there. I was a real little show-off when I was little. First of all, I was a cuddly type. But I do remember sitting in my father's lap once when he took me off, and I knew he didn't think it was proper anymore, which hurt me a little bit. All right, he didn't want to cuddle me. But anyhow, I like to show off, and I used to dance and do things and improvise and stand up and make up stories as you go along and tell them and everything. So I'm doing this for the relatives, and they're all chuckling and laughing. But your father was terribly hurt. He couldn't understand. He's so embarrassed for me that I wasn't embarrassed. That my father came over to me and said, "Ceils, please don't. Your brother can't stand it." He was hiding behind the chamber. But it wasn't right that he did that to me because that was good for me. That was good, so
Right.
it showed off.
Right, you needed
It was
that.
harmless.
You needed
A
that.
little girl who shows
So
off.
basically, also the Jewish holidays then weren't celebrated. Except for, did you have Passover Seder?
This Passover.
Just Passover.
Oh, my mother
But you
was
were
very...
sleeping, so you wouldn't remember the Seder.
What,
If you were sleeping because you had wine, you wouldn't remember
oh,
Passover
wait
Seder.
a moment. That was when I was very little. Oh, yeah, afterwards I remember. You couldn't open no.
Your mouth, yeah.
You didn't say a word. Oh, no. So...
But you didn't go to temple like on the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur.
Oh, I had plenty of it when I
Was
got
the
married.
store open? No, I know that. Was the store open?
No.
On Rosh Hashanah?
No.
Did they close for the Jewish holidays?
No, but as I said, and when things became good,
Then they went to the free
then they
synagogue,
went.
right?
Then they went. They followed tradition. But
But it wasn't kosher. You never had a kosher house.
when they say not kosher, my mother used kosher food,
Well,
but it was like I would keep it.
right.
And, not,
Yeah,
don't worry about the
Yeah,
dishes.
it's interesting because most of our friends or relatives, like Mickey and other people that are so concerned with keeping their Judaism now, were brought up in homes where, well, it was like yours too, where the grandparents had a kosher home, and people would keep it kosher until the grandparents died,
Right.
and then they didn't keep it kosher anymore. So you're more secular Jews,
I'm sorry.
more secular.
Oh, yes,
Secular
definitely.
Jews.
But remember, I grew up in a Christian environment.
Right, in Providence.